Here you are again, prepared to turn the page. You know the risk, and know the danger. Let us begin. Kinlochleven wasn't always a tourist destination, but over time it had grown to be one of the highest rated parts of the Scottish Highlands for the tourist types to come and take pictures. They would arrive in droves every summer, snap their selfies in front of the fjord, have some beer at the pubs, and then leave until the next summer. And so it went, year after year. That was fine, and the influx of cash into the community didn't hurt either. Helen, Kristina, and Jacob were three such tourists. But where others wanted to see the loch or hike in the Rocky Highlands, these three came in search of other things. They rented a home just out of town that looked out over a wide open grassy field. The house itself sat in a bowl, and there were many sheep whose shit helped fertilize the grass they ate. No one ever claimed the sheep as their own, and the owner of the house grumbled about their nuisance every time she came to check up on the property.
I know it's a little outdated,
the old woman said when the three tourists arrived. They were looking through the house to get their bearings.
It's all fine for us,
Kristina assured her.
That's good. And you said you wanted to rent the place for 2 weeks?
That's right.
The two did the necessary calculations on the price per person for the length of their intended stay and settled upon a final amount, half of which they paid right then. With that, the woman left them the spare key and drove back into town. As soon as she left, Helen picked up her luggage bag and laid it open on the table in the kitchen. There, she pulled out several notebooks and pictures of old yellowed papers that wouldn't have survived the journey. She made quite the extravagant mess on the table by the time she was through. Kristina and Jacob helped organize it all as Helen continued her extraction. Finally satisfied, she took the bag back into a bedroom in the rear of the old house.
Where do you guys want to start looking?
Kristina asked, tapping her chin with a finger and looking over one of the maps. It was an old hand-drawn one, which covered approximately half of Glencoe. Jacob took another map, a modern one with streets and population centers, and laid it out side by side with the smaller hand-drawn one.
I think we should start near the northern exit from the glen.
Helen returned and spoke over his shoulder.
You know that's where everyone else has already looked. There'll be nothing there but trash. The place has been picked clean.
Kristina, Helen, and Jacob weren't ordinary tourists. They were treasure hunters, riddle solvers, and amateur historians. They also seemed to think there was more to the story of the Glencoe massacre of 1692 than the reports had suggested. The three were here to look for proof, and to share in the spoils if they found it. The days flew past, and the three had found small trinkets here or there. Some of them even dated back to the right time period, but none of these would keep them around for long. They needed something unique. Finally, tired of looking in the same places repeatedly, dodging police officers and park conservationists, the trio did something a little more unorthodox. They had already been in town for a week of their 2-week stay, and their fence back home was getting impatient. Jacob hadn't been idly sifting through clumps of dirt, digging up old lumps of iron. He'd been using the evenings to read into every story, account, or diary that he could find about the events of the Glencoe massacre. Most of these, the team read long ago, but not all of them. It was his job on the team to find the minor details that may otherwise get overlooked. In the evening of the 8th day, Jacob found it. There were always rumors about the wailing banshee foretelling the massacre, but every scholar the trio had spoken with attributed it to the people who had escaped and heard the death cries echoing through the glen on the wind. Even some first-hand accounts from the more educated of the time figured the tales were nonsense. Jacob's task was to find the three something unique, so he couldn't tie himself to the things the other historians, scholars, and treasure hunters believed. He freed himself from those suppositions, and even if his partners gave him sideways glances, it had worked out for them in the past. They were staying in an old house, but this property had been the site of an even older house, and then 2 more before that. The wood had long since rotted away, but the founding people of the glen had laid some stones in the very house where they had rented. Kristina had selected the place online because she believed it to be the best priced location in the area. She hoped they would be far enough away for privacy and close as possible to the expected relic site. She didn't know that they were staying inside a relic of that time. The next morning, they went out with their metal detectors and surveyed a map of the property. The three obtained it from the village records building. Kristina had sneaked in the night prior and located the paperwork easily enough. It wasn't as though many people feared the town records were a prime burglary target. A rock dam sat across a low point in the property's rear. Alongside it sat a pump and a set of pipes that ran water back up to the house. But a few hundred years ago, the people who lived there wouldn't have had a pump. They would have had to walk over to the stream themselves. That wasn't the nicest thing to do in a snowy Highlands winter. Jacob guessed correctly that the previous house on the property had sat considerably closer to the stream than the current iteration. Kinlochleven was an ancient village, and Kristina found the first of many old iron tools and instruments from the 1700s onwards, at a place near the stream. They had found nothing that can get them back in time far enough to cue the hunters in on treasures from the massacre. That evening, they went back up to the house hopeful, but tired. They all had a cold dinner because, between the three of them, no one had the energy or desire to cook anything. They lit a fire in the fireplace to help the old heating system warm the house back up. It was late in the autumn, and when the owner said there was some renovation work needed, she had meant the heating and insulation. There were bottles of local Scotch Highland whiskey in the cabinet, and they helped themselves, toasting their own ingenuity in what they had found thus far, and hoped for more to learn and discover the next day. The evening drew onwards in the small drawing of small revelries. Kristina had more to drink than the others would have recommended, and she began boasting about how much more they could probably find on the property before their time was up.
No one has looked here. You've seen the ground. There isn't any evidence of turned earth. There's a site out there that is completely untouched. It's a gold mine.
Helen got up from where she had been lounging in the chair next to the window.
You say that, but maybe there's a reason no one has bothered to search. You think maybe it's because there isn't anything there?
Jacob's personal stance was somewhere in the middle. He had tired of the endless rotating conversation and stepped out onto the porch with his drink. He rested it lightly on the worn porch railing and turned on the light. The soft yellow glow of a weathered bulb gave the place an eerie atmosphere, but he put it out of his mind until, after a few moments, he noticed the normally constant sounds of insects were gone. Even the irritating braying sheep were silent. Jacob picked up the flashlight, sitting on a metal table next to the chairs on the porch. He clicked it on and swung the beam back and forth out into the darkness in front of the old house. His first pass didn't reveal anything, and it relaxed slightly. Kristina and Helen's voices echoed from inside, and, like a slowly cresting wave, their argument hit a crescendo. He almost went back inside to ask them to spare his sanity and quiet down, but on nothing more than the tiniest hint of instinct, he swung the flashlight across the grass again. There, standing alone in the dark, a man stood facing away from the house. He had long, shaggy brown hair down his back, bare feet, and he was looking at something further out. He didn't seem to notice Jacob's light, or even the house behind him. Jacob's pulse shot up in surprise, and he felt his heart thud in his chest.
You there. What are you doing?
The man didn't answer, didn't turn to face him, and didn't even give any sign he had heard him.
Who are you?
He said, trying a different tack. Still, no answer returned to him. Jacob kept the man in his gaze as he slowly backed up towards the door to the house. With one hand behind him, he turned the knob and opened it.
Guys, get out here.
The sound of shuffling feet and the creak of a chair flowed out of the house, but Jacob didn't dare turn away from the man. More than his sudden emergence out of the night, more than his strange appearance, there was something he couldn't pin down in the back of his mind that unnerved him.
What is it?
Helena asked, sounding half drunk and half asleep, as though she hadn't just been arguing with Kristina moments before. She had come to the door first and stepped out onto the porch. Jacob saw her out of his peripherals. She stopped dead when she spotted the man in front of the house.
Come out, you treasonous Campbells. There's a Jacobite you missed.
The man's voice rolled out like thunder. It was full of rage and grief.
Come out and face me.
The three hunters stared at the form of the man in the grass. He was still facing away from them. They couldn't see his face, and he didn't appear to be speaking to them. There was no one else out in the dark that they could sense. At least, no voice answered his calls.
Sir, who are you?
Jacob called again, taking a single brave step off the porch. This time, the man wheeled to face the group. His eyes were crazed with a manic fury. There were red slashes across his bare chest like he had clawed himself bloody.
I am a MacDonald, and what's more, I'm the one the treacherous Campbells missed on their blood-soaked raid. Are you with them? You who look so warm and well-fed in your home?
Jacob almost took the clear references of the Glencoe massacre and rolled his eyes at the performance. It was too perfect that someone must be trying to scare them off the property. There was only one thing that stopped this thought. When Jacob stepped closer to the man, he noticed something odd about him beyond the things he had already accounted for. Anyone could dress up and act out a script, but whatever this man was, he wasn't human. Jacob could just make out the rocks of the ancient wall that ringed the front of the property. He could see them to the left and the right of the man, but he could also see them through him. As soon as the realization locked into his mind, Jacob stumbled back, tripped on the step of the porch and fell to the creaking wood. He scrambled back to his feet, shining his flashlight at the spectre. Kristina gasped from the doorway. She had seen it too, and Helen took another moment before she processed what she was seeing.
Ye came in the night. You took our hospitality and spat it on the ground. Come out!
The ghost, if that was what it was, moved closer to the house. He came all the way up to the edge of the porch, and the three treasure hunters could now clearly make out his translucent form. Spittle flew from his lips as he yelled and raged at them. He pulled a short knife from a pouch on his side, and both his anger and the blade looked very real. He almost had time to step up onto the wood of the porch before finally, another voice answered him out of the night.
Andrew MacDonald, you sick bastard. I've come to hear your petty accusations.
Kristina grabbed the back of Jacob's shirt and pulled him through the door. Helen followed immediately afterwards, and they slammed it shut. Another man seemed to coalesce in from the fog of the night. Both stood facing each other in front of the house. A ghostly breeze blew their hair about as they argued. Jacob moved to the window in the kitchen. He leaned over the empty sink to look out into the darkness. He could just barely make out the men's words.
Lucas, I know what you've done. After all we've done for you and your men.
The spectre of Andrew MacDonald called. He poked the other man in the chest.
I had my orders, and by the Lord I followed them. You and your clan should have given your fealty months ago. All of this could have been avoided.
Lucas returned. He looked down at the knife in Andrew's ghostly hand.
Are you come to revenge yourself?
I've come for justice. There are others out in the snow whom you left for dead. We're all here to stick a knife in your belly like you did to my wife. Like you did to my daughter.
Andrew pulled his hand back at that and swung his arm in an overhead stroke. It didn't have any power behind it, and it didn't appear to be a direct attack. Instead, the motion seemed to be a signal, because within 10 seconds, dozens of ghostly figures rose and flowed out of the fog around the spirit of Lucas Campbell.
I can't believe what I'm seeing,
Kristina said, whispering to the others. The ghostly conflict outside carried on, the crowding spirits listening to Lucas's rebuttal for the accused offenses.
Me neither. You don't think we're in any danger, right? They're like ghosts. They can't touch us.
There was a questioning tone in his voice. He was trying to convince himself as much as the others, but none of them had seen ghosts in such an angered state before. A person tended to run amok of paranormal entities eventually when in the treasure hunting business, but usually they were of the living variety. Monsters usually kept to themselves and away from people, but treasure hunters never stuck around the well-protected places. There was no money to be found there.
I haven't heard anything like this since last year when the Appalachia rose out of the ocean. Well, this doesn't match anyway. That was a long way from here, and there's been sightings of him since. This is new.
The noise from outside changed. Instead of voices, they heard the ringing of metal. Jacob refocused his attention out the window. Lucas had drawn a long knife of his own, along with a flashpan pistol. The knife dripped with a silvery substance. One shade held his arm as if pained. Andrew MacDonald roared in challenge.
You bastard. You know my family's dead. If it wasn't you, then it was one of your men.
You mean one of these men?
More shapes materialized out of the dark. They arrived silently and surrounded the MacDonalds. Each held muskets in their hands and bladed weapons at their sides. There was a roar that shook the house's windows as, in a single moment, the whole of the company fired their ghostly weapons at each other. The first volley dropped a few on each side, but smoothbore firearms aren't remotely accurate, and dead shades cannot die again. Those that did fall soon rose again and rejoined the fight. After firing their weapons, the groups drew their swords and knives rather than reloading. the grass outside the house became a ghostly melee. There was something special about the blades. While the musket rounds had only passed harmlessly through the ghosts, the edges of the swords left silvery streaks in the forms of the long dead. The three treasure hunters stood inside, glued to the windows and transfixed by what they saw. One by one, the ghosts fell to the blades of the others. There, they lay on the ground in shadowy heaps. Only Andrew MacDonald and Lucas Campbell remained standing, each bleeding silvery droplets on the grass. They moved towards one another, and their weapons clashed, and the irons sang. With a final slash, Andrew slit Lucas's throat, but not before Lucas buried his knife in Andrew's ribs. They fell to the ground together in a heap, and all was finally silent again. The quiet didn't last long. As if in answer to the battle, a wind whipped up through the property, battering the old wooden slats against the house and sending the wind chimes clattering against the beams where they were hung. It whistled in high, piercing notes. Jacob opened the front door and stepped back out onto the porch. From there, he could see where the wind had originated. It was coming up from the stream, or rather, from the site of the old house. The breeze split and swirled in little eddies that tugged Jacob in different directions as they each moved past. When the air reached the still, ghostly forms on the grass, it picked them up and dissolved them back into the mist and fog. Carrying its solemn burden back the way it came, the wind disappeared, leaving Jacob alone on the porch. Helen and Kristina joined him a moment later. Awe splashed clearly across their faces. They thought it was over, and they thought they were safe once again. The three standing there on the porch breathed a sigh of relief. They had thought wrong.
"Did you enjoy the little display?"
said a voice. It was deep and raspy. The three jumped, and Jacob's skin crawled as the voice rolled over him. It was powerful, ancient, and vile.
Who are you?
Jacob asked out into the darkness for the second time that night.
"You broke their seal. You uncovered their cairn. The loop of their demise is yours. I was their jailer."
We didn't do any of that.
It was utter bullshit, but she'd learned a long time ago to admit nothing when threatened.
"These beings are not benevolent shades. They died in anger, and now they persist in anger."
The voice echoed in their ears, as if it were floating just an inch away from them. Helen spun to look behind her, but only saw the door slowly bouncing against the jamb in the remaining breeze.
What do you want?
Her voice trembled, and Jacob knew he would have too, if he had had the courage to speak. A form, solid this time, stepped out of the shadows. It was human-sized, but with a sharp beak instead of a face. The being was gaunt and covered in blue-black tattered robes. Its fingers were unnaturally long and sharpened to jagged spikes. It placed a heavy scythe, covered in silver serrations, down in the soft grass. The thing leaned on the wooden handle like a walking stick.
"I want their souls back in their cage."
This last sentence came harsh as the biting wind.
We can't get Pandora's box. They're already dead and the wind has already taken them.
She stepped off the porch, approaching the thing in front of them. She swayed drunkenly as she walked, and Jacob realized she must have kept drinking while the ghostly fight went on. It was one way of dealing with the paranormal, but it wasn't the smartest.
Helen, get back here!
He whispered, pleading with her. She either hadn't heard him or didn't care. Helen stepped right up in front of the being and looked him up and down.
You don't look like a jailer,
she said, scoffing. The creature didn't move for a second. Then, with a sigh, it lifted its scythe and whipped it through the air in front of it. The whole motion had only taken a breath, and then it leaned lightly on it again. Jacob couldn't believe it hadn't hit Helen. But then, as he watched, Helen lifted a hand towards her face, inspecting it.
Huh. I didn't think it would happen like that.
Her hand slowly faded into the same ghostly fog as the Scots from before, and the rest of her body quickly followed it. Kristina let out a gasp, completely stunned. Jacob couldn't register what it had meant for a moment either. His brain couldn't compute what his eyes told him. And in that space, that heartbeat, Helen dropped to the ground. The wind returned and swirled about her, picking up her now ghostly form and dispersing it into a million pieces.
Return the cairn to its resting place.
Its tone hadn't changed, and nor had its stance. It looked as though it considered what it had just done, only flicking a buck.
Bring her back!
Jacob cried, coming out of his shock in a fury. He stepped forward, but not quite off the porch, and not quite out of its halo of light.
Return the cairn.
The thing repeated.
No!
Kristina screamed at it. She pulled her pistol from somewhere. Jacob didn't even see her bring it out with her. He thought it was still in their luggage. She pulled the trigger twice, firing wildly with tears clouding her eyes, making the bullets fly off into the darkness. The creature looked at her as she fired without moving. Finally, when Kristina's magazine clipped empty, it looked down. She hit the thing with a single round, but as it glanced down to look over itself, Jacob knew it wouldn't prove to be nearly enough. It let out another sigh and tilted its head to the sky. With a great crowing call, the raspy voice let loose a call.
Spirits to me. There has been insult done tonight. You shall rectify it.
The wind answered the monster's call, and within seconds Jacob saw hundreds of ghostly forms swirling in the breeze. They landed in the distant tree line and stalked up towards the house. Kristina and Jacob's courage failed them, and they fled back into the house. The two locked the door and threw a table in front of it. They needn't have bothered. The ghosts walked through it as if simply the door was still open. Up close, Jacob saw these were different. They seemed a mix of times. Some wore helmets from World War I, others stepped through the door clad in kilts with varying patterns. Still more came in wearing modern clothes, but all of them had the eyes of warriors. All as one, the storm of ghosts fell upon the inglorious thieves who had desecrated the sole forge of Kinloch Leven. The creature, jailer of the forge, stepped up to their bodies once the ghosts had finished their work. With one swipe of his scythe, he tore the fleeing souls from their bodies and reduced their physical form to motes of dust. The old woman came to check on the house the next morning, having heard a disturbance in the night. She knew what events the wind had brought and already knew what she would find there. Moving carefully, the woman went to the stream behind her house and relaid the overturned stones in their proper places. Then, whispering a soft prayer, she left.
Well, welcome back, Dark Valiants. It's been a while since I've gotten to get in front of the microphone after one of our chapters. I'm really sorry about that. We're coming into this part of the act that needs that extra time boiling in the pits of hell to really bring it into its dark and swirling glory. There are some important things in these recent episodes, as well as the ones to come, connections of the dots, if you will. So be on the lookout. This story, Unquiet Dead, was written by Devin McCamey. Our narrator is Jeremiah John. The voice of Andrew MacDonald was also Jeremiah John. The old woman, Helen, and Kristina were voiced by the always spectacular Rosie Knuckles. Gorath Hyun lent his dark talents to voicing Jacob, Lucas Campbell, and the jailer of the Soul Forge. Speaking of the Soul Forge, Lawrence Lyons absolutely outdid himself bringing it to life in post-production with the audio effects and music. Brandon McCamey honored us with the rights to another of his spectacular pieces. Really, the piece came first and I built the story off of it. This time, I cannot even imagine how this would have turned out the other way around. Finally, our outro music by Pierce Roswell and sound effects in this episode are courtesy of Epidemic Sound. If you want to find out when new episodes drop, please follow us on YouTube or your podcast supplier of choice, or head over to our website at www.mortismaledictum.com. Thank you for listening.
And thus, the story is ended. The tale told. The chapter closed.